The midday sun filters through the blinds at Ashford Memory Care, casting long shadows across Martin Reynolds' vacant face. Once a decorated K-9 officer, he now sits, unmoving, unresponsive to his family's desperate attempts to reach him through the fog of Alzheimer's. But when a German shepherd's bark echoes from outside, Martin's eyes suddenly focus Diesel. He whispers a name his family hasn't heard in years. This is the extraordinary story of a bond that transcends memory itself. The reunion doesn't just break medical understanding. It changes everything we know about memory, loyalty, and the connection between humans and their four-legged partners. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Julia Reynolds pushes through the heavy glass doors of Ashford Memory Care, her arms laden with shopping bags. The antiseptic smell hits her immediately. That clinical scent unsuccessfully masked by artificial air fresheners. She forces a smile at the receptionist, a middle-aged woman whose sympathetic expression has become all too familiar. "Morning, Julia," the receptionist says, already reaching for the visitor log. "He's having a good day, I think." Julia's smile falters slightly. She's learned that good days are relative when it comes to her grandfather. Sometimes it means he's calm instead of agitated. Sometimes it means he smiled at a nurse. It rarely means recognition. "Thanks, Linda," Julia says, signing her name with practiced efficiency. "Dad's coming by later." The corridors of Ashford Memory Care are painted in soft, neutral colors designed to be soothing. Photographs of local landmarks line the walls, intended to trigger familiarity. In minds that struggle with the concept, Julia walks with purpose, nodding at staff members who know her by name. Now 3 times a week without fail, she comes to visit the man who once taught her how to fish, how to change a tire, how to stand up for herself. Martin Reynolds sits by the window in the common room, his thin frame dwarfed by a plush armchair. Sunlight catches the silver of his hair, giving him an almost ethereal appearance. His weathered hands rest on his lap, occasionally twitching with involuntary movements. He stares out at the carefully landscaped garden, though Julia wonders if he actually sees it. "Hey, Grandpa," she says, keeping her voice bright as she sets her bags down and pulls up a chair next to him. "I brought some things for your room." Martin turns slowly, his pale blue eyes taking a moment to focus on her face. There's no spark of recognition, just the polite confusion he might show a friendly stranger. "Hello," he says, his voice raspy from underuse. "It's a nice day." Julia swallows hard, pushing down the familiar ache. "It is a nice day, perfect for our visit." She reaches into one of her bags and pulls out a photo album. "I thought we could look at some pictures together." Martin nods absently, his attention already drifting back to the window. Julia opens the album anyway, pointing to a family photo from last Christmas. "Look, here's Dad and Mom. We had dinner at their house, remember? Kevin came home from Colorado." Martin looks at the photograph with mild interest, but there's no connection, no memory stirring behind his eyes. Julia flips through more pages, a ritual. She performs every visit, narrating their family history as if repetition alone might carve these faces back into his memory. "And here's you at my college graduation. You were so proud you kept telling everyone in the restaurant that I was going to be a veterinarian." A nurse walks by, giving Julia an encouraging smile. She returns it automatically, turning another page in the album. "Oh, and here's..." Julia stops mid-sentence. The photograph shows a younger Martin in his police uniform, kneeling beside a handsome German shepherd. Both look alert, professional, ready for action. It was taken at least 15 years ago, before retirement, before the diagnosis, before everything changed. Martin's eyes drift to the photograph, and something changes in his expression. He leans forward slightly, a subtle shift that might be imperceptible to someone who hasn't spent months studying his every reaction for signs of the man he used to be. "Diesel," he says clearly, his finger reaching out to touch the image of the dog. Julia freezes, her heart suddenly racing. "Yes," she whispers. "That's Diesel, your partner." Martin looks at the photograph with an intensity that's been absent for months. Best nose in the department, never missed a scent. Julia's hands tremble as she turns to the next page, which shows Martin and Diesel at a training exercise. "You worked together for a long time." 8 years, Martin says promptly, the number coming to him without hesitation. He saved my life in the Millicent case. Julia's mind races. Her grandfather can't remember what he had for breakfast, often can't recognize his own son, but he remembers details about a dog he hasn't seen in years. She turns another page showing Diesel receiving some kind of departmental award, a medal hanging around his neck. Brave boy, Martin murmurs, a hint of pride warming his voice. Never hesitated. The moment passes as quickly as it came. Martin's focus drifts, his eyes returning to the window. The brief connection slips away, leaving Julia with the familiar stranger in its place. I'm tired now, Martin says vaguely, his hands resuming their restless movement. Julia closes the album, her mind whirling with possibilities. That's okay, Grandpa. I'll let you rest. She kisses his forehead before gathering her things. Her movements is automatic. While her thoughts race ahead in the corridor, she pulls out her phone and dials her father. Dad, she says when he answers, something just happened with Grandpa, something important. Mark Reynolds arrives at Ashford. Memory gigation round begins. He finds Julia in the small cafeteria nursing a cup of tea that has long since gone cold. What happened? He asks, sliding into the chair across from her. The worry lines around his eyes have deepened over the past 2 years, aging him beyond his 55 years. Julia pushes the photo album toward him, open to the page with Martin and Diesel he recognized. Him, Dad. He knew Diesel immediately. Mark frowned, studying the photograph. Are you sure it wasn't just what a coincidence? A random moment of clarity. Julia leans forward. He knew Diesel's name. He remembered. They worked together for 8 years. He mentioned something about a Millicent case. Mark's expression changes, surprise replacing skepticism. The Millicent drug bust that was a big case made the local papers. Diesel found a hidden compartment in a wall where they'd stored evidence. See, Julia's voice rises with excitement. He remembers Dad. He remembers Diesel when he can't even remember us. Mark runs a hand through his graying hair, his police training evident in the careful way he processes this information. Julia, even if he did have a moment of recognition, it doesn't change his diagnosis. Alzheimer's has these fluctuations, but what if it's more than that? Julia insists. What if seeing Diesel again could help him? What if there's something about that connection that's strong enough to break through where nothing else has? Mark shakes his head, the gentle denial of a man who has already accepted the inevitable. Honey, Diesel was rehomed after Dad's retirement. That was, 6 years ago? We have no idea where he is now. Or, even if he's still alive, but we could find out. Julia persists. You're still connected to the department. There must be records, someone who knows where service dogs go after retirement. Julia. Mark's voice carries a warning. I don't want you getting your hopes up. Even if by some miracle we found Diesel, there's no guarantee it would make any difference to Dad's condition. Julia reaches across the table, gripping her father's hand. But what if it does? What if it gives him even a few minutes of being himself again? Wouldn't that be worth it? The silent standoff between father and daughter is interrupted by Dr. Nicholas Taylor, the neurologist who oversees Martin's care. His presence is unexpected enough that both Reynolds turn to him with questioning look. Sorry to interrupt, Dr. Taylor says, his professional demeanor softened by genuine compassion. Linda mentioned you were discussing something that happened during today's visit. Julia straightens. My grandfather recognized his former K9 partner in a photograph. He remembered specific details about their work together. Dr. Taylor pulls up a chair. His interest clearly piqued. That's fascinating. Long-term memory can sometimes remain intact even as short-term memory deteriorates. But specific recognition like that is noteworthy. Could seeing the actual dog again help him? Julia asks, shooting a triumphant look at her father. Dr. Taylor considers this carefully. I can't make any promises. Alzheimer's is complex, and what triggers recognition one day might not work the next, but there's growing research about emotional memory persisting when other types fade. Strong emotional connections like the bond with a service animal can sometimes remain accessible. Mark looks between them, his resistance wavering. So you're saying we should try to find Diesel? I'm saying it might be worth exploring. Dr. Taylor clarifies. At the very least, it wouldn't do any harm. And at best, well, sometimes we see surprising results when patients reconnect with significant elements from their past. Julia's gaze returns to the photograph, to her grandfather's proud stance beside the alert German shepherd who had been more than just a working partner. Then it's settled, we're going to find Diesel. The determination in her voice leaves no room for argument. Mark sigh, recognizing the stubborn set of her jaw, the same expression their father used to get when he'd made up his mind about something. I'll make some calls, he concedes, but Julia, please, I know Dad, don't get my hopes up. She closes the album gently, but hope is all we have left. Isn't it? Later that evening, Julia sits at her kitchen table, surrounded by opened boxes she hasn't touched in years after leaving Ashford. She'd gone straight to her parents' house, retrieving everything related to her grandfather's police career from the attic. Now photographs, commendations, newspaper clippings, and old logbooks cover every inch of available space. She sorts methodically through the material, looking for anything that might help track down Diesel's whereabouts. After Martin's retirement, most of the documents tell her things she already knows. Her grandfather joined the K9 unit after 5 years as a patrol officer. He and Diesel specialized in narcotics detection and suspect apprehension. They received multiple commendations for their work. The doorbell interrupts her search. Julia opens it to find her father looking tired but resolute. "Any luck?" she asks, stepping aside to let him in. Mark shakes his head. Official records just show that Diesel was released from service and adopted privately. No name, no contact information. Julia's shoulders slump. "That's it, there has to be more." "There is," Mark says, holding up his phone. "James Wilson still works with the K9 unit. He remembers Dad and Diesel. He's going to meet us tomorrow." Hope flutters in Julia's chest. "Really? You think he knows where Diesel ended up?" "I don't know," Mark admits, "but it's a start." Julia gestures to the chaos of papers covering her table. "I've been going through everything. There's so much about their work together, but nothing about what happened after Grandpa retired." Mark picks up a framed photograph, studying it quietly. It shows Martin and Diesel at a department ceremony, both looking formal and dignified. They were quite a team. Dad used to say Diesel was the smartest partner he ever had. "Smarter than you," Julia teases, trying to lighten the moment. Mark smiles faintly. "According to Dad, definitely less paperwork too." They share a brief laugh, a moment of normalcy in the midst of their ongoing grief. Mark sets the photograph down carefully. "Julia," he says, his voice serious again, "I need you to understand something. Even if we find Diesel, even if by some miracle this dog is still alive and we can arrange a reunion, it might not. Dad might not." "I know," Julia interrupts softly, "but we have to try." "You saw how he responded to just a photograph. Imagine what seeing Diesel in person might do." Mark nods slowly. "Okay, we'll see what Officer Wilson has to say tomorrow," as her father leaves. Julia returns to her makeshift investigation board. Somewhere out there is a German shepherd who might hold the key to unlocking her grandfather's memories, even if just for a moment, and she's going to find him no matter what it takes. She picks up the photograph of Martin and Diesel, studying their posture, the evident trust between them. "Where are you, boy?" she whispers to the image of the dog. "We need you." He needs you outside. The evening settles into night stars, appearing one by one in the darkening sky in his room at Ashford Memory Care. Martin Reynolds sleeps restlessly, his dreams filled with the sounds of paws on pavement and the comforting weight of a loyal partner by his side. And somewhere, perhaps not as far away as Julia fears, an aging German shepherd with knowing eyes might still remember the man who once meant everything to him. Telling and preparing this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. The Ashford Police Department hasn't changed much since Julia last visited. The same faded blue walls, the scuffed linoleum floors, the bulletin boards covered with community notices and wanted posters. She follows her father through the front entrance, noticing how officers nod respectfully at Mark, a gesture of professional courtesy to a retired detective officer. James Wilson waits for them in a small conference room, a manila folder on the hair table in front of him. At 60, he carries himself with the rigid posture of a career lawman, but his eyes are kind behind wire-rimmed glasses. He stands when they enter, extending a hand first to Mark, then to Julia. "It's good to see you both, though I wish it were under better circumstances," Wilson says, gesturing for them to sit. "Mark filled me In about Martin, I'm sorry to hear he's struggling. Julia studies Officer Wilson, trying to place him in the fragments of memory she has of her grandfather's colleagues. Did you work directly with my grandfather? Bilson nods, a faint smile crossing his weathered face. I joined the K9 unit a year. Before your grandfather retired, he showed me the ropes, taught me things about handling that weren't in any training manual. He taps the folder. Martin Reynolds was a legend in this department, him and Diesel both. That's why we're here. Julia says, leaning forward, we need to find Diesel. Wilson's expression shifts, becoming guarded. That might be complicated. It's been, 6 years since your grandfather retired, almost 7. Mark corrects, Dad was diagnosed about a year after leaving the force. Wilson opens the folder, revealing a collection of documents and photographs according to our records. Diesel was 8 when your father retired, which made him too old for reassignment to another handler. Standard protocol would have been adoption, usually to the handler or their family. Julia exchanges a quick glance with her father, but that didn't happen. No, Wilson confirms your grandfather was going through his own medical issues at the time. I remember there was some confusion about who would take Diesel. Mark frowns. Dad was having memory problems, but they hadn't diagnosed Alzheimer's yet. Mom was still alive then, but she couldn't manage Diesel on her own. Wilson nods sympathetically. The department has a process for these situations. If the handler can't adopt, we offer the dog to other officers, then to approved families. He slides a form across the table. This shows Diesel was adopted by someone named Deborah Wilson. Julia reads the document, her heart sinking at the unfamiliar name. Who is she? Does she still have him? No relation to me, despite the shared surname. Wilson says she was a neighbor of your parents at the time. According to this, she took Diesel when it became clear your father couldn't care for him anymore. Mark runs a hand through his hair, frustration evident. I remember her, lived across the street, older lady. I lost track of her after Mom died and we moved Dad to assisted living. Do you have any idea where she is now? Julia asks, struggling to keep the desperation from her voice. Wilson shakes his head. The address listed here is your parents' old neighborhood. Beyond that, we don't keep track once the adoption is finalized. He hesitates, choosing his next words carefully. I should mention that Diesel would be around 15 now. That's exceptionally old for a German Shepherd, especially one who worked as hard as he did. The implication hangs heavy in the air. Julia refuses to acknowledge it. We have to try, even if it's just to know what happened to him. Officer Wilson studies her for a moment, then nods decisively. I understand. Let me make a few calls. See if anyone in the department kept in touch with this Deborah Wilson. He stands, excusing himself to use the phone at his desk, left alone. Julia turns to her father. Did you know about this woman who took Diesel? Mark looks tired, the weight of past decisions evident in his posture. Vaguely, it was a chaotic time. Julia, Mom was trying to handle Dad's initial symptoms. I was juggling work and helping them, and you were finishing veterinary school. Diesel was... He trails off, looking guilty, an afterthought. Julia finishes, unable to keep the accusation from her voice. That's not fair, Mark says quietly. We were doing the best we could with the information we had. None of us knew how bad Dad's condition would get. Julia softens, recognizing the pain in her father's eyes. I'm sorry, I just wish we had known how important this connection might be. Officer Wilson returns before Mark can respond. I've got something, he says, a note of triumph in his voice. Deborah Wilson moved to Pinneridge Retirement Community about 4 years ago. One of our dispatchers volunteers there. Hope surges through Julia. That's less than 20 meters from here. There's more. Wilson continues. My contact says she remembers Deborah having a German Shepherd until about a year ago, when her health declined, and she had to move into the assisted living section, no pets allowed. Julia's heart sinks. So we're back to square one. Wilson shakes his head. Not quite. Apparently, Deborah's sister took the dog. Margaret Wilson lives out near Lakeside. You have an address? Mark asks, already standing. Wilson hands him a slip of paper. And a phone number. My contact says Margaret is usually home in the afternoons. Julia takes the paper, her hand trembling slightly. Thank you. You have no idea what this means to us. Wilson's expression softens. I think I do. Martin and Diesel were something special, the bond between a handler and their K9. It's different from ordinary partnerships. He reaches into the folder and pulls out an old photograph, handing it to Julia. "You should have this." The photograph shows her grandfather and Diesel in the middle of a training exercise, both completely focused on their task. The mutual trust is palpable. Even in this frozen moment, he talked to that dog like he understood every word. Wilson says quietly. "And the thing is, I think he did." As they leave the police station, Julia clutches the photograph and the precious contact information. The morning sun breaks through the clouds, casting long shadows across the parking lot. "What now?" Mark asks, keys in hand. Julia checks her watch. "It's almost noon. Let's try calling Margaret Wilson." Mark nods, dialing the number on his phone and putting it on speaker after 4 rings. A woman's voice answers. "Hello, Mrs. Wilson." "Margaret Wilson," Mark begins. "My name is Mark Reynolds. My father is Martin Reynolds, the former police officer who owned Diesel." There's a pause on the other end of the line. "The police dog, my sister Deborah took him in years ago." "Yes," Julia chimes in. "We're trying to locate Diesel. It's very important." "May I ask why?" Margaret's tone is cautious. Protective. Mark and Julia exchange glances. "My father has Alzheimer's." Mark explains he recently recognized Diesel in a photograph. When he couldn't recognize his own family, we think seeing Diesel might help him. Another longer pause follows when Margaret speaks again. Her voice has softened. "I'm sorry to hear about your father. Deborah always spoke highly of him. Do you know where Diesel is now?" Julia asks, unable to contain herself any longer. "I took him when Deborah moved into assisted living," Margaret confirms. "But only temporarily. He was older, needed specialized care I couldn't provide. I found him a place at the Awakens Animal Sanctuary about 8 months ago." Julia scribbles down. "The name is that near Lakeside?" "Yes, just outside town. They specialize in senior animals and those with special needs. I visit him occasionally." He slowed down. "Quite a bit, but he's doing well considering his age." Relief floods through Julia. "Thank you so much, Mrs. Wilson. This means everything to us." After getting directions to the sanctuary, they end the call. Julia looks at her father, new determination in her eyes. "Oh, kids, we need to go." Now Mark hesitates. "Shouldn't we call first? Make sure they'll let us see him." "No time," Julia insists. "If we call, they might say no. If we show up in person with our story, how can they refuse the drive to Awakens Animal Sanctuary?" Takes 40 minutes winding through countryside roads that lead away from Ashford's suburbs. Neither Julia nor Mark speaks much, each lost in their own thoughts about what they might find, or whether they're pursuing false hope. Awakens turns out to be a sprawling property, more farm than facility, with several acres of fenced meadows and a cluster of barn-like structures. The main building is a renovated farmhouse with a cheerful sign proclaiming Awakens Animal Sanctuary, where every senior pet deserves dignity. They park in the small gravel lot and approach the reception area. A young man with kind eyes greets them from behind a counter cluttered with donation jars and pamphlets. "Welcome to Awakens. I'm Lucas Freeman. How can I help you today?" Julia steps forward. "We're looking for a dog who was brought here about 8 months ago, a German shepherd named Diesel." Lucas's expression shifts from welcoming to cautious. "Are you family of Margaret Wilson?" "No," Mark interjects. "We're connected to Diesel's original owner, Martin Reynolds." Recognition flickers in Lucas's eyes. "The police officer Margaret mentioned him when she brought Diesel in." "My grandfather," Julia confirms, "he has Alzheimer's now, but he recognized Diesel in a photograph recently. We believe seeing him might help trigger more memories." Lucas considers this information, clearly weighing policy against compassion. "I'll need to check with Melissa. Our behaviorist Diesel is one of our special cases. He's quite elderly now, and we're careful about who interacts with him." "Please," Julia says, emotion cracking her voice. "This is important." Lucas nods sympathetically. "Wait here, I'll page Melissa." As Lucas disappears into a back office, Julia paces the small reception area, examining the photos of success stories that line the walls. Elderly dogs lounging in sunny spots, cats curled in comfortable beds, even a few horses grazing in peaceful pastures. "This seems like a good place." Mark observes his detective's eyes, taking in the clean, well-maintained facility. Before Julia can respond, a door opens and a woman in her mid-40s enters, her auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail. She wears cargo pants and a polo shirt with the Awakens logo, and her expression is both professional and kind. "I'm Melissa, Bennett, animal behaviorist here at Awakens." She introduces herself. "Lucas tells me you're inquiring about Diesel." Julia explains their situation again, watching Melissa's face carefully for signs of how she might respond when she finishes. Melissa's expression is thoughtful. "Diesel has been with us for 8 months. She says he's 15 years old, which is remarkable for his breed, especially given his working background. He's slowed down considerably, has some arthritis in his hips, and his hearing isn't what it used to be, but his mind is still sharp." "Can we see him?" Julia asks. Melissa studies them for a moment. "Normally we have strict protocols about visitation, especially for animals that aren't up for adoption, but this is a unique situation." She makes a decision. "Follow me, I'll take you to him, but I need to be present for the interaction. His welfare is my primary concern." Relief floods through Julia as they follow Melissa through the building and out a back door that leads to a series of fenced enclosures. Each contains comfortable-looking doghouses, shade structures, and various enrichment toys. "We keep our senior dogs in these private yards during the day." Melissa explains they get regular walks and social time, but also plenty of rest. She leads them to an enclosure at the end of the row. Inside, lying on a padded bed beneath an oak tree, is a German Shepherd, whose dark muzzle is now frosted with gray. His ears perk up as they approach, and despite his obvious age, there's an alertness to his gaze that speaks to years of professional training. "Diesel," Melissa calls softly. "You have visitors." The old dog rises slowly, his movements careful but deliberate. He approaches the fence, his dark eyes studying the strangers with interest despite his gray muzzle and slightly stiff gait. His bearing still reflects his training. Dignified, attentive, evaluating. Julia kneels at the fence, her heart racing. "Diesel, do you remember the Reynolds family?" Diesel's ears twitch at the name, his head tilting slightly in the universal dog gesture of curiosity. "He might not remember you if he never spent much time with you," Melissa cautions gently. "But he might remember my grandfather," Julia says, looking up at Melissa with pleading eyes. "Could we bring him here?" Melissa hesitates, her professional judgment at war with the emotion of the moment. Bringing someone with Alzheimer's here could be disruptive for them and potentially stressful for Diesel, or it could be the breakthrough my father needs. Mark interjects. "We're not asking to take Diesel away, just a supervised visit here in your facility where he feels safe." Diesel watches this exchange, his intelligent eyes moving from one person to another as if following the conversation. Then unexpectedly he moves closer to the fence where Julia kneels and extends his nose toward her, sniffing carefully. "He's curious about you." Melissa observes, her resolve softening. "That's a good sign." Julia remains still, letting the old dog investigate her scent. "We brought something," she says quietly, reaching slowly into her pocket to pull out a faded blue handkerchief. "It was my grandfather's. He always carried it." She holds it up for Melissa's inspection before offering it to Diesel. Through the fence, the German Shepherd's reaction is immediate and unmistakable. He sniffs the handkerchief intently, then makes a soft whining sound, his tail beginning to wag. Melissa's eyebrows raise. "That's interesting. He definitely recognizes that scent. Does that mean we can try?" Julia asks, hope surging through her. Melissa sighs, then nods slowly. "We'll need to set it up properly. Controlled environment, minimal distractions, escape routes for both Diesel and your grandfather. If either becomes overwhelmed, she becomes businesslike. I'll need to check your grandfather's current condition with his care team. Get proper permissions from all parties." "Of course," Mark agrees quickly. "Whatever you need." "No, guarantees," Melissa warns. "This needs to be beneficial for Diesel as well. If he shows any signs of stress, we end the session." "Immediately understood," Julia says, relief making her voice tremble. "When can we do it?" "I'll need a day to make arrangements and consult with my team." Melissa says, "Can you bring your grandfather here the day after tomorrow morning is best? Our seniors tend to have more energy." Then as they finalize details, Julia keeps her eyes on Diesel, who is settled by the fence occasionally, sniffing the handkerchief she left for him. The old dog's eyes, though clouded slightly with age, still hold the alertness and intelligence that made him an exceptional police K9. "We'll see you soon, boy," she whispers as they prepare to leave, "and we're bringing someone special to see you." Diesel's ears prick forward at her voice, his head tilting as if trying to place a half-remembered sound for a moment. Julia can imagine him as he must have been in his prime, powerful, confident, the perfect partner for her grandfather when both were at the height of their abilities. Now they're both in the winter of their lives, slowed by age and circumstance. But perhaps the connection forged between them remains strong enough to break through even the fog of Alzheimer's, if only for a moment as they drive back toward Ashford. Preparations already forming in their minds, neither Julia nor Mark speaks the fear that haunts them both. What if it doesn't work? What if the spark of recognition Martin showed was just a fleeting anomaly, never to be repeated? Julia stares out the window at the passing landscape, clinging to the memory of Diesel's response to her grandfather's scent. That recognition was real, and where there's recognition, there's possibility it's going to work, she says finally, as much to convince herself as her father. It has to. Mark doesn't contradict her, but his hands tighten on the steering wheel, bearing the weight of cautious hope and the fear of yet another disappointment in a journey that has already held too many. The next 24 hours pass in a flurry of preparations. Julia and Mark divide responsibilities, each tackling different aspects of the upcoming reunion. Mark coordinates with Dr. Taylor and the staff at Ashford Memory Care, explaining the situation and securing necessary permissions. Julia works with Melissa at Oakage, planning every detail of the visit to ensure it will be comfortable for both Martin and Diesel by evening. Julia finds herself sitting at her kitchen table, once again surrounded by photographs of her grandfather and Diesel. She studies them carefully, looking for clues about their relationship, anything that might help maximize the chances of recognition in one photo. Martin uses a specific hand signal that Julia hasn't seen before. In another, she notices a distinctive whistle hanging around her grandfather's neck. Her phone rings. It's her father. "Everything's set with Ashford," Mark says without preamble. "Dr. Taylor thinks this is worth trying. He's coming along to observe." "That's good," Julia replies, stifling a yawn. It's nearly midnight, but sleep feels impossible with so much at stake. Melissa called earlier. They're setting up a quiet room with minimal distractions. She suggested bringing familiar objects from Grandpa's past. "I've got his old jacket from the department, the one he wore during K9 training." Julia considers this. "Perfect. And I found some photos of specific commands he used with Diesel. We might need them." The conversation pauses, both aware of the unspoken question hanging between them. Will any of this actually work? "How's he doing today?" Julia asks finally. Mark sighs. "About the same. Didn't recognize me at first. Kept asking for your grandmother." The pain in his voice is evident, but controlled. "By the end of the visit, he called me by name." Though that's something Julia offers, though they both know these brief moments of clarity have become increasingly rare. Another silence stretches between them. Then Mark says what they've both been thinking. "Julia, we need to be prepared for this. Not to work for Diesel, not to remember him, or for Dad, not to respond the way we hope. I know," she says quietly, "but we have to try." The morning of the reunion dawns clear and cool. A perfect early autumn day. Julia arrives at Ashford Memory Care just as her father pulls into the parking lot. They meet at the entrance, exchanging tense smiles. "Ready?" Mark asks Julia. Nods, though. Ready feels like an impossible state. They've planned everything they can, but the outcome depends on factors beyond their control. The mysterious workings of a mind affected by Alzheimer's, the memory of an elderly dog, the strength of a bond formed years ago inside. They find Dr. Taylor waiting in the lobby, clipboard in hand. His professional demeanor is tempered by genuine interest in the experiment they're about to conduct. Martin's having a relatively clear morning. He informs them he's dressed and had breakfast. Nurses say he's been calm, though he didn't recognize. "And them, did you tell him where we're going?" Mark asks. Dr. Taylor shakes his head. "I thought it might be better to keep it as a surprise. Too much anticipation could agitate him." They proceed to Martin's room, where they find him sitting in an armchair by the window, staring out at the garden. He's wearing khaki pants and a button-up shirt, his white hair neatly Combed for a moment, Julia sees a shadow of the commanding police officer he once was. "Good morning, Grandpa," she says cheerfully, approaching him with a smile. "We're going on a little field trip today." Martin turns to look at her, his expression pleasant but distant. "A trip?" "That's right, Dad," Mark says, holding up a light jacket. "We're going to visit a special place. You'll need this." Martin allows them to help him into the jacket and guide him to the waiting van. Dr. Taylor follows, carrying a bag containing Martin's medications and emergency supplies. The drive to Oakage takes longer than before, the van moving carefully to accommodate its fragile passenger throughout the journey. Julia watches her grandfather's face, searching for any sign of awareness or anticipation. Martin gazes out the window, occasionally commenting on the trees or the sky, but showing no understanding of where they're headed when they arrive at Oakage. Melissa is waiting for them in the parking lot. She approaches the van as they help Martin out, introducing herself with the practiced gentleness of someone accustomed to working with the elderly Mr. Reynolds. "I'm Melissa. Welcome to Oakage. We have someone special waiting to see you." Martin nods politely, but his eyes drift past her to the buildings beyond. "Nice place," he remarks vaguely. They proceed slowly, allowing Martin to set the pace. Julia notices that the usual activity of the sanctuary seems subdued. Melissa has clearly arranged for minimal distractions during their visit. "We've prepared a quiet room for the introduction," Melissa explains softly to Julia and Mark. "Diesel is already inside with Lucas. He's calm, had a good night's rest, and we did some gentle stretching exercises for his arthritis this morning." They reach a door marked Visitation Room. Melissa pauses, her hand on the doorknob. "Remember, no sudden movements or loud noises. If either of them shows signs of distress, we'll end the session." "Are we ready?" Julia and Mark exchange a glance, then nod. Dr. Taylor positions himself slightly apart, clipboard, ready to document whatever happens next. "Mr. Reynolds," Melissa says, addressing Martin directly. "There's someone in here who used to know you very well. Would you like to say hello?" Martin looks confused but not agitated. "All right," he agrees with the docile compliance that has become characteristic since his illness progressed. Melissa opens the door. The room beyond is simple but comfortable. A small sofa, several chairs, soft lighting, and windows that look out onto a private garden area. In the center of the room, seated calmly beside Lucas, is Diesel. The German Shepherd's ears immediately prick forward as the door opens. His dark eyes fix on the group entering, scanning each face with the assessment of a trained police dog. When his gaze reaches Martin, he becomes completely still, his focus absolute for a moment. No one moves. Julia holds her breath, watching her grandfather's face for any sign of recognition. Martin stares at Diesel, his expression unchanged. Then slowly, Diesel rises to his feet. Despite his age and stiffness, he moves with purpose, taking a step toward Martin. Lucas keeps a loose hold on his leash, allowing the approach but ready to intervene if necessary. "There's a dog," Martin observes, stating the obvious. There's no indication that he recognizes Diesel as anything other than a random animal. Julia's heart sinks. Mark places a supportive hand on her shoulder, sharing her disappointment, but Diesel continues his approach, moving deliberately until he stands directly in front of Martin. The old dog lifts his nose, sniffing Martin's hand, then his clothes. He makes a soft sound in his throat. Not quite a whine, not quite a bark. Martin looks down at him with mild interest. "Hello, dog," he says politely. Melissa glances at Julia and Mark, her expression suggesting they might need to accept that this experiment has failed, but she doesn't intervene. Yet, allowing the interaction to continue a bit longer, Diesel sits directly in front of Martin, his posture formal, almost military in its precision. He looks up at Martin's face, ears forward, waiting. Julia remembers something from the photograph she studied, Dad. She whispers to Mark. "The command whistle, do you have it?" Mark fumbles in his pocket, producing a tarnished metal whistle on a worn lanyard. He hands it to Julia, who approaches slowly. "Grandpa," she says gently, "I found something of yours. Do you remember this?" She places the whistle in Martin's hand. He looks at it curiously, turning it over in his fingers. "A whistle," he says, showing no particular recognition. "You used to use it." Julia prompts for commands. Martin continues examining the whistle, his brow furrowing slightly, as if trying to grasp at something just beyond his reach. Then unexpectedly, he raises the whistle to his lips and produces a sharp, distinctive sound, a specific pattern that Julia doesn't recognize. The effect on Diesel is immediate and extraordinary. The old dog instantly changes position, moving from sitting to a perfect down posture, his eyes never leaving Martin's face. The room goes completely still. Martin stares at Diesel, his expression changing from polite disinterest to something harder to define, confusion perhaps, or the first stirrings of recognition. He listened, Martin says, sounding surprised. He did what I told him. Yes, Julia says, her voice trembling with emotion. He knows your commands. Martin looks at the whistle again, then back at Diesel. Something shifts in his eyes, a shadow lifting, a door opening somewhere in the depths of his mind. Stand, he says suddenly, his voice taking on a tone of authority that has been absent for months. Diesel immediately rises to a standing position, still maintaining perfect focus on Martin. Check. Martin commands next, using a term that means nothing to Julia but clearly communicates to Diesel, who begins to systematically move around the room, sniffing deliberately at corners and under furniture, just as he would have done when searching for contraband during his working days. Julia exchanges an astonished glance with her father, whose eyes have filled with tears. Dr. Taylor is scribbling furiously on his clipboard, documenting this remarkable interaction. Martin watches Diesel complete his check of the room, a strange expression crossing, his face confusion mingled with something like wonder. When Diesel returns to stand in front of him, Martin reaches out a hesitant hand. Good boy, he says softly, then more firmly, Diesel, good boy, Diesel. The name, he said. The name. Diesel responds with a soft whine, pressing his head against Martin's hand. Martin's fingers automatically find the spot behind Diesel's ears that he always favored, scratching gently. My partner, Martin murmurs, his voice thick with emotion. He likely doesn't fully understand. My good boy. For several minutes no one speaks. They watch as Martin continues to pet Diesel, occasionally issuing a quiet command that the dog responds to without hesitation. Despite the years that have passed, the connection between them, forged through thousands of hours of training and fieldwork, transcends the ravages of time and illness. Then Martin looks up, his gaze finding Mark. He got old, he says, a note of sadness in his voice. Yes, Dad, Mark replies gently, you both did. Martin nods, accepting this. We had a good run, though. He returns his attention to Diesel, who hasn't moved from his side. Didn't we, boy? Julia moves closer, kneeling beside her grandfather's chair. Grandpa, do you remember Diesel from when you worked together? Martin's brow furrows again, the effort of connecting past and present visible on his face. We caught the bad guys, he says finally. He could find anything. Best knows in the department, the same phrase he'd used when looking at the photograph. Dr. Taylor approaches cautiously, not wanting to disrupt the moment, but professionally fascinated by what he's witnessing. Mr. Reynolds, can you tell us about working with Diesel for a moment? Julia fears the question might break the spell, pushing her grandfather to access memories he can't reach. But Martin straightens slightly, his hand still resting on Diesel's head. Training was 6 months, he says with unexpected clarity. Had to learn to trust each other. He's smarter than most rookies I trained. A ghost of a smile crosses his face. First arrest was a dealer hiding in a warehouse. Diesel found him in 2 minutes flat. Julia and Mark exchange amazed glances. These are specific memories, details Martin hasn't been able to access in conversation for months. He saved my life once, Martin continues, his voice taking on a storyteller's cadence. Suspect had a knife, thought he was hiding. Good enough. Diesel knew better. He looks down at the aged dog with unmistakable pride. Got a commendation for that one, didn't you, boy? Diesel responds to Martin's tone with a soft whine, leaning his weight against Martin's legs. The mutual comfort between them is palpable, too. Old warriors reunited, each bearing the marks of battles fought both together and apart. Dr. Taylor makes a small gesture to Julia and Mark, indicating they should step back and allow this reunion to unfold without interference. They move to the edge of the room, watching with a mixture of joy and disbelief as Martin continues talking to Diesel, recounting fragments of their shared past. He remembers. Julia whispers, tears streaming down her face. He actually remembers. Mark puts an arm around his daughter's shoulders. Not everything he cautions gently, but more than yesterday, more than we thought possible. Melissa joins them, her professional demeanor softened by the emotional scene before her. "This is remarkable," she says quietly. "In my 15 years working with therapy animals, I've never seen anything quite like it." "Will it last?" Mark asks, voicing the question that hangs over this miraculous moment. Dr. Taylor shakes his head slightly. "There's no way to know. Alzheimer's is unpredictable. These moments of clarity might be fleeting, or they might recur with similar stimuli." He gestures toward Martin and Diesel. "But what's happening right now is significant regardless of its duration." Julia watches as her grandfather leans forward, resting his forehead briefly against Diesel's. The simple gesture communicates a depth of understanding and connection that transcends words. "What happens now?" she asks, turning to Melissa. "Can they spend more time together?" Melissa considers this carefully. Diesel is a resident here, not a therapy dog. His age and health have to be our primary considerations. She pauses, watching the pair. "But I think we could arrange regular visits, properly supervised and timed to respect both their needs for rest. Could we bring Grandpa here weekly?" Julia suggests same day, same time to establish a routine. Dr. Taylor nods approvingly. Routine is beneficial. For Alzheimer's patients, consistency helps with orientation. Wednesdays might work best. Melissa offers our volunteer schedule is lighter, meaning fewer distractions, and Diesel tends to have good energy in the mornings after his Tuesday therapy sessions as the adults discuss logistics. Martin continues his quiet communion with Diesel. He's now showing the dog his whistle, explaining something about training protocols that only Diesel seems to fully understand. The disconnect between Martin's usual confused state and this focused, articulate interaction is striking. Has anyone documented this kind of species spanning? Martin looks up at her confusion, returning to his eyes for a moment. She fears he's already slipped back into his fog, that he won't understand why they need to leave Diesel behind. "We have to go," he asks, his voice suddenly smaller, less certain. "Yes, Grandpa, Diesel needs to rest, and so do you, but we'll come back next week." Martin looks down at Diesel, who remains loyally by his side. "He'll be here." "Yes," Melissa assures him. "Diesel lives here now. He'll be waiting for you when you return." Martin nods slowly, processing this information. Then, with the precision of muscle memory, he gives Diesel a hand signal. The old dog immediately sits at attention, awaiting further instruction. "Guard," Martin says clearly. It's obviously a command from their working days, one that tells Diesel to stay vigilant. Diesel responds by straightening his posture, his expression becoming more alert despite his evident fatigue. Martin nods, satisfied. "Good boy, I'll be back." He reaches down to stroke Diesel's head one more time. Partners, the simple word carries such weight that even Lucas, who has remained quietly in the background throughout the visit, looks moved. Diesel leans into Martin's touch, a soft whine escaping him as if he understands that their time together is ending as they help Martin to his feet. Diesel rises too, standing at attention until Martin has been guided to the door. It's only when the door closes behind them that Julia, glancing back through the window, sees Diesel finally relax his stance, settling back onto the floor, with what looks remarkably like a sigh. The return journey to Ashford Memory Care is quiet. Martin dozes in the van, exhausted by the emotional and mental exertion of the visit. Julia and Mark exchange occasional glances, each afraid to voice the question, burning in both their minds. Will he remember any of this tomorrow? Dr. Taylor breaks the silence as they near Ashford. "What we witnessed today was extraordinary," he says quietly. "I'd like to document it properly. Perhaps even publish a case study if you're amenable." Mark looks skeptical. "You think anyone would believe it with proper documentation and continuing observations?" "Yes, this could help other families, other patients." Dr. Taylor glances at Martin's sleeping form. What triggered his recognition wasn't just seeing Diesel, it was engaging in their working patterns, the whistle, the commands, the routines they established over years of partnership. Julia considers this. "You think we could use that somehow, create more moments like today?" Possibly. Memory is complex, especially with Alzheimer's. But procedural memory, the memory of how to do things, often persists longer than declarative memory, like names and faces. Dr. Taylor's enthusiasm is tempered by professional caution. "I don't want to create false hope. Today might have been exceptional, but it's certainly worth exploring further when they arrive at Ashford. Martin wakes, looking disoriented. Where are we? He asks the alert. Clarity from earlier completely gone home, Dad. Mark says gently. We're taking you home. They help Martin back to his room, where Nurse Linda takes over, helping him into a comfortable chair and checking his vital signs. How was the outing? She asks Julia quietly. Amazing. Julia replies, better than we could have hoped. She hesitates, then adds, he remembered his dog, remembered working with him. Commands even specific cases. Linda's eyebrows rise in surprise. That's wonderful, though. She glances at Martin, who is already staring vacantly out the window again. These moments can be fleeting, we know, Mark says. But we'll take whatever we can get as they prepare to leave. Julia approaches her grandfather. Last time, Grandpa, we're going now. But we had a good day, didn't we? You saw Diesel. Martin turns to look at her, his expression pleasant but uncomprehending. Who's Diesel? The question lands like a physical blow. Just like that, the connection is gone. The door closed once more. Julia forces herself to smile through her disappointment. A friend, you'll see him again soon outside in the hallway. Julia finally lets her composure crack. It's like it never happened, she whispers to her father. Mark puts an arm around her shoulders. But it did happen, we saw it, and maybe next time something will stick. Dr. Taylor, overhearing, offers a professional perspective. The memory centers in his brain are damaged. But what we saw today suggests some neural pathways remain intact, activated by the right stimuli. It's not about making him remember today's visit. It's about continuing to access those pathways through regular interaction with Diesel. Julia nods, trying to find comfort in this clinical explanation for the emotional roller coaster they've just experienced. So we keep bringing him back every week. And we document everything, Dr. Taylor adds. Build a case study that might help others as they leave Ashford. Julia feels both drained and strangely energized. The visit didn't produce a miracle. Cure her grandfather still has. Alzheimer's still doesn't recognize his family most of the time, but for one precious hour they glimpse the man behind the disease. The sharp mind and devoted heart that made Martin Reynolds who he truly is in the parking lot. As she and her father prepare to go their separate ways, Julia turns to Mark. It's worth it, isn't it? Even if it's just moments, even if he forgets as soon as we leave, Mark considers this, his face reflecting the complex emotions of the day. You know what got me when he said, partner's not past tense, present, as if no time had passed at all. He clears his throat, fighting back emotion. That's the dad I remember, and if Diesel can bring him back even for an hour, yeah, it's worth everything. As Julia drives home, her mind replays the day's events, the moment of recognition, the commands, the stories, the connection that transcended both time and illness. She thinks about the photographs and documents spread across her kitchen table, the clues she'd gathered in her search for Diesel. Perhaps there are more clues there, more keys to unlocking her grandfather's memories. Perhaps with research and patience they can find other triggers, other pathways back to the man they love. Due sun is setting. As she reaches her house, painting the sky in vivid oranges and pinks, Julia pauses in her driveway, taking a moment to appreciate the beauty of it, to feel gratitude for the gift they received today. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. Martin might not remember Diesel at all. The next visit might not trigger the same remarkable response, but today, for one precious hour, a partnership forged in trust and service proved stronger than disease, stronger than time itself. And for today, that is enough. The next week passes with agonizing slowness. Julia throws herself into research, spending evenings poring over articles about animal-assisted therapy for dementia patients while her days are filled with her regular veterinary practice. Each night she adds new findings to a binder labeled Project Diesel, organizing information that might help maximize the impact of future visits. Mark focuses on the practical aspects, coordinating with Ashford staff to ensure Martin's schedule accommodates the weekly trips he meets with Dr. Taylor twice to review plans and expectations, careful not to let hope overshadow reality. When Wednesday finally arrives, Julia wakes before dawn, anxiety and anticipation making sleep impossible. She arrives at Ashford early, clutching a leather pouch containing items she's gathered based on Her research Martin's old badge photographs of specific training exercises and a small vial of the cologne he wore during his working years. Mark is already wading deep in conversation with Dr. Taylor. The neurologist looks up as Julia approaches, his expression cautiously optimistic. "How is he this morning?" Julia asks, immediately mixed. Dr. Taylor replies he had some agitation overnight, but he's calmer now. He's dressed and ready, though he doesn't seem to remember why. Mark adds, "I've been with him for the past hour. He recognized me as the detective, but not as his son." Julia absorbs this information, adjusting her expectations if Martin doesn't recognize his own son today. What are the chances he'll remember Diesel when they enter Martin's room? They find him sitting in his usual chair by the window, but fully dressed in slacks and a button-down shirt. His hair is combed neatly, and he looks up with mild interest as they enter. "Good morning, Grandpa," Julia says brightly. "Ready for our outing?" Martin studies her face. "We're going somewhere." "Yes, to visit a friend, someone special." His brow furrows slightly. "I don't have friends anymore." The simple statement, delivered without self-pity, just as a matter of fact, breaks Julia's heart. "You do." She insists gently, "and he's waiting for us." The drive to Oakage seems longer this time. Weighted by uncertainty, Martin gazes out the window, occasionally commenting on passing scenery, but showing no recognition of their destination or purpose when they arrive. Melissa greets them with professional warmth. "Good morning, Mr. Reynolds. Welcome back to Oakage." Martin nods politely, viewing her as a stranger. Julia shares a concerned glance with her father. If Martin doesn't remember Melissa, will he remember Diesel? They're led to the same quiet room as before. This time, Diesel is already waiting inside, resting on a comfortable pad near a sunny window. The German Shepherd lifts his head as they enter, his dark eyes immediately finding Martin. Martin pauses in the doorway, his expression blank. There's a dog, he observes, just as he did the week before. Julia and Mark exchange disappointed glances. They're back to square one, but Melissa doesn't seem concerned. "Why don't you sit down, Mr. Reynolds?" she suggests, guiding him to a chair near Diesel. Sometimes it takes a moment for connections to form. Martin sits obediently, watching Diesel with polite interest, but no recognition. Julia approaches, kneeling beside her grandfather's chair. She opens the leather pouch and removes the command whistle, placing it in Martin's hand. "Grandpa, do you remember this?" Martin examines the whistle, turning it over in his fingers. Unlike last week, there's no spark of familiarity in his eyes. "A whistle," he says simply. Julia tries not to let her disappointment show. "It's your special whistle for giving commands. Would you like to try it?" Martin looks confused but accommodating. "What should I do with it? Just blow it." Once Julia suggests demonstrating a simple puff of air, Martin raises the whistle to his lips and blows, not the specific pattern he used last week, just a single sharp tweet. Diesel's reaction is immediate. He rises from his pad and approaches Martin, his posture alert and attentive. He sits directly in front of Martin, waiting for further instruction. Martin looks startled by the dog's response. "He listened to me." "He knows you," Julia explains gently. "His name is Diesel. He was your partner when you worked for the police." Martin studies Diesel with new interest. "My partner." He repeats the concept clearly. Strange to him, I don't remember a dog. Julia reaches into her pouch again, producing Martin's old badge. "You were a K9 handler. You and Diesel worked together for 8 years. Martin takes the badge, running his thumb over the worn metal. Something shifts in his expression. Not recognition exactly, but a stirring of something deeper. Diesel, perhaps sensing the importance of this moment, moves closer. He places his head on Martin's knee, looking up with solemn eyes, automatically as if guided by muscle memory. Martin's hand comes to rest on Diesel's head. The gesture seems to surprise him, but he doesn't withdraw. "He's a good dog?" Martin asks, his tone uncertain. "The best," Mark confirms, moving closer. "Dad, do you remember training with Diesel, the obstacle courses at the department?" Martin shakes his head slowly, still petting Diesel. I can't see it." Julia tries a different approach. From her pouch, she withdraws a small cloth spritzed with Martin's old cologne. "Grandpa, this might help your memory." She places it near him, allowing the scent to reach both Martin and Diesel. The effect is subtle, but noticeable. Diesel's tail begins to wag more vigorously, and he presses closer to Martin. Martin inhales deeply. his expression changing as the familiar scent registers. "I wore this," he says, sounding surprised every day. "Yes," Julia confirms. "When you were working." When you were with Diesel, Martin continues petting Diesel, his movements becoming more natural, less hesitant. "We worked together." He repeats, not quite a question, not quite a statement. Dr. Taylor, who has been observing quietly, makes a note on his clipboard. "Mr. Reynolds does Diesel remind you of anything specific, any particular day or event?" Martin's brow furrows with concentration. The effort of trying to access locked memories is visible on his face. "There was rain," he says. "Finally. A lot of rain. We were wet." The statement is so unexpected that Julia and Mark exchange confused glances. Neither recalls Martin mentioning a rainy day incident during the previous visit. Lightning, Martin continues, his voice growing stronger. "Thunder made." The other dog's nervous, not Diesel, steady as a rock. Mark leans forward. "Dad, are you talking about the Miller case, the standoff during that big storm?" Martin doesn't answer directly, but his hand moves to scratch behind Diesel's ear in exactly the spot the dog prefers. "Had to wait 6 hours in that drainage ditch, soaked to the bone. This guy never complained once." He looks down at Diesel with clear affection. "Best partner I ever had." The room falls silent as everyone absorbs what's happening. Unlike the previous visit, Martin hasn't suddenly regained full clarity about his relationship with Diesel. There's still confusion in his eyes, still uncertainty about where and when he is. But fragments of memory are surfacing, different ones from last week, specific and detailed. The memory patterns are fascinating. Dr. Taylor murmurs to Melissa, "Not linear, not comprehensive, but authentic and detailed. Like accessing random files, rather than a sequential narrative." Melissa nods. "It's similar to what we see in therapy sessions with veterans, sensory triggers, accessing isolated memories rather than complete timelines." Martin continues speaking now, telling Diesel about a training exercise involving underwater recovery. The details are precise water temperature, visibility conditions, the specific commands used. But his narrative jumps erratically between times and places, blending different incidents into a fragmented mosaic. Julia realizes they're witnessing something both precious and heartbreaking. Not the dramatic breakthrough of the first visit, but something perhaps more realistic. Martin isn't miraculously cured, but in Diesel's presence, pathways to specific memories become accessible, allowing glimpses of the man he was. The session continues for nearly an hour. Some moments are remarkable. Martin, demonstrating hand, signals that Diesel immediately responds to recalling the names of other handlers from the K9 unit, describing training techniques in detail. Other moments are frustrating. Martin suddenly asking where they are, not recognizing Mark, or Julia becoming briefly agitated when he can't place a memory that feels just out of reach throughout it all. Diesel remains steadfast, his calm presence seemingly anchoring Martin even during confused moments. When Martin becomes frustrated, Diesel presses closer, drawing his attention back with a gentle nudge or a paw on his knee. As the hour draws to a close, Martin shows signs of fatigue. His sentences become less coherent, his focus wandering. Dr. Taylor signals that it's time to end the session. "Mr. Reynolds," he says gently, "it's time for us to head back to Ashford now, but we'll visit Diesel again next week." Martin looks down at Diesel, genuine sadness crossing his face. "He can't come with us. He lives here now," Julia explains softly. "But we'll come back to see him, I promise." Martin nods slowly, processing this information, then surprising everyone, he turns to Melissa. "You'll take care of him. He needs his special food, sensitive stomach." Melissa glances at Julia, who nods in confirmation. "Diesel did indeed have dietary restrictions during his working years. We take excellent care of him." Melissa assures Martin special food, and all this project has become more than just an attempt to help her grandfather. It's evolving into a map of his life, a collection of the experiences and connections that made him who he was. And even if Martin can access only fragments of that life at any given time, those fragments are precious beyond measure to those who love him. As she drives home, Julia finds herself talking aloud as if Diesel was sitting beside her in the passenger seat. "We're getting through to him, buddy. One memory at a time. He's still in there, and somehow you're helping us find him." 4 weeks into their Wednesday routine, patterns begin to emerge. Each visit to Oakage brings different memories, different connections, different versions of Martin emerging from the fog of Alzheimer's. Some days are better than others. The third visit brought barely any recognition, while the fourth sparked vivid recollections of a drug bust near the harbor that even Mark had forgotten today. Marks their fifth visit, and Julia arrives at Ashford with cautious optimism. She's learned not to expect consistency, not to measure success by the standards of that first miraculous reunion. Instead, she treasures each moment of connection, each fragment of memory, each glimpse of the grandfather she knew in the lobby. She finds not just Mark and Dr. Taylor waiting, but also Nurse Linda, who rarely leaves the facility during working hours. Is everything okay? Julia asks immediately, fear clutching at her chest. Bad days with Alzheimer's can be truly bad. Agitation, aggression, complete disorientation. Linda smiles reassuringly. Everything's fine, better than fine, actually. Dr. Taylor asked me to come along today to observe. I spend more time with your grandfather than anyone else, so I might notice changes. The rest of you? Miss? Changes? Julia repeats, turning to Dr. Taylor with questioning eyes. The neurologist tempers his response with professional caution. Nothing dramatic. But there are some interesting patterns emerging. Martin's sundowning episodes have decreased on Wednesdays and Thursdays. Julia knows the term sundowning refers to the increased confusion and agitation many Alzheimer's patients experience in the late afternoon and evening. It's been a particular challenge with Martin, often resulting in distressing episodes. You think it's connected to the visits? Mark asks, joining the conversation. It's too early to draw definitive conclusions, Dr. Taylor says, but the correlation is notable. His overall agitation levels have decreased slightly in the past month, and his sleep patterns show improvement on days following Diesel visits. Julia absorbs this information, hope fluttering in her chest. Are you saying the effects are lasting longer beyond just the time he spends with Diesel? Possibly that's partially why I've asked Linda to join us today. Her observations will help create a more complete picture. They find Martin in the garden, rather than his room, sitting on a bench beneath a maple tree, whose leaves have begun to turn gold.